Today we have a great story of getting revenge on a scammer for an entire year. We'll get into that in a bit, but first, sit there laughing at me at the petrol station? I'll inconvenience you even more. This was a few years ago. I pulled into my local petrol station. All the pumps were in use, so I pulled up behind one of the pumps waiting for the van using it to finish and move off. After quite a few minutes, the driver casually strolled out of the shop in no hurry, despite the queue at the busy forecourt, and walked to his van. He could see that I and several other vehicles were queuing to use the pumps. The van driver in the pump next to him was obviously a friend. That driver finished up and the two of them stood and had a chat. They were aware of us waiting and were clearly loving the fact that they were holding us all up, even turning to laugh arrogantly at the guy waiting next to me who called to them to move away from the pumps. This went on for 5 more minutes until they got bored of their silly game and drove off. The moron was a plasterer and had his name and phone number written all over his van, plying his trade. Oh boy, I'm petty and made a note of his details. A few weeks later, I called him up and said I'd bought a house in need of renovation and needed a quote to board out and skim the entire house. Oh, and he was only too happy to quote for a big project, assuring me that he was great at his trade and I could not find a better quote. We discussed his availability and he was keen to come and look at the job. I gave him the address of a rundown house a few streets away from me that had recently sold at auction. He knew the property, he had driven past it a few times and noticed it was up for auction. We arranged for him to call the following day. Of course, I wasn't there. He rang a few times and left a voicemail checking where I was. Eventually, I called him back, very apologetic, said my husband had fallen off of a ladder and I had to take him to A&E. He said, okay, I'll rearrange the visit. We arranged another time a few days later. The next appointment came and I had 2 more messages from him, clearly annoyed I wasn't there again. I called him back and apologized. I said I could totally understand his anger and wasted time. It reminded me of the time I was sat at a petrol station a few weeks ago, and some idiot and his mate stood having a good old chat whilst laughing at the drivers waiting to use the pumps. I heard the penny drop. That was when the raging and swearing started, which just set me off roaring with laughter. I made my point. It was fabulous. I spent the next few weeks blocking various numbers sending abusive texts, but he got bored of that eventually. I hope he learned that actions have consequences. I feel like it would be one thing if him and his friend were having that chat there and they just somehow were oblivious to the people around them, like if they just had very terrible spatial awareness. But you know that person's a grade A jerk if they're willing to stand there, look at the people waiting in line and laugh at them. Regardless, I love hearing stories like this of somebody, like for example, who's a road rager who forgets that they have branding all over their truck, or that like bumper sticker that says, "How's my driving? Call so-and-so to comment." SN Orpheus commented, "I'll never understand why people with name and number of their business on the side of vehicles aren't better behaved. I've done similar antics, though not as well planned or executed. Kudos to you on this brilliant maneuver." Also, hi, I'm Steven, and if you guys enjoy awesome stories of revenge, it would be amazing if you left a like or left a review if you're listening to my podcast. That said, our next story is Steal My Meds So You Get the Flu. This happened over 10 years ago. I'd been living with this guy and I kept my prescriptions in a basket on the counter. I noticed that my PRN Valium was low and I just had it filled. I went and got a refill and the next week it was low. Now mind you, I hadn't taken any. Come to find out the guy was supplying his buddies with my Valium. So I get a bottle of Dulcolax laxative pills and replaced the Valium with it and hid the real stuff. Needless to say, he and his buddies came down with a bad case of the flu, and it was funny to see all of them running to the bathroom at the funeral home when his mom passed. I kept that Valium bottle filled with Dulcolax until the day I moved out and left it there. Please tell me that this guy was dumb enough to keep taking it time and time again, not realizing, I sure do seem to get the runs quite a bit after taking all this Valium. King of the Eyesores commented, "Had a coworker steal some of my metformin thinking it was something for ADHD. For anyone who doesn't know, metformin causes extreme gastric distress if it's not taken with food. Even with food, I couldn't handle it, I had to go off of it, so she took some right away and had to wait until she finally stopped pooing to go home sick." Our next story is, Be a Butt, I Will Make You Late. This happened back in 2012 to 2013. I was driving downtown looking for a parking spot. One opened up right on the road where I needed to be. I put my signal on and made that move all drivers make slightly to the right, indicating that I'm taking that parking spot. I was getting ready to parallel park, and a transit bus pulls right up behind me against my bumper, so I cannot back up. Now my view is this is a professional driver and they should know better, so I, being the petty guy I am, sat there waiting for him to back up. At this point, the bus driver is starting to wave his hands and lean on his horn. I'm a patient guy, and I decided to wait him out as he's honking his horn. I have a few hours to spend, so I'm not concerned about the time, whereas the transit driver has a tight schedule, so I know he's not happy. I pull out my work notebook and start doing some work. He's getting more angry and trying to intimidate me to move. The thing is, I'm a big guy, 6'6" and 200 pounds, so I'm not going to be intimidated. This is the main downtown thoroughfare, and traffic is starting to back up considerably. Eventually, someone with authority comes along and basically tells the bus driver he is wrong. However, because of traffic now, he cannot back up, and I don't want to give up my parking spot. So I agree to move ahead just enough for the bus to pull out into the opposing traffic lane and pass me. That's allowing me into my parking spot. I am confident that he will not try to pull that move again, and I had the satisfaction of watching him sweat, knowing that he's now behind schedule, and at some point, he'll have to explain that to his boss. Imagine he's one of the ones that has like that super surveillance system installed in that bus where they can pull up any of that like dashboard cam so they can see this guy willingly choose to pull up right behind this innocent person that's just trying to pull into a parking spot. For that driver's sake, they better hope they don't have something like that. Zyler Ghost commented, "Kudos, that was a masterful move. Glad you could wait him out without disturbing your own schedule." I thank you on behalf of all the drivers in the world who have had awful experiences like this with bus drivers. If we're able to wait them out, I say go for it. Nobody needs to be intimidated by bus drivers who behave like entitled jerks. Our next story is the reason why my ex is my ex. Many years ago, after the birth of my oldest son, I desperately needed a job. I was scouring through the job section of as many newspapers as I could get my hands on. The pickings were slim as my highest qualification was graduating high school. I had to ignore minimum wage jobs because it would cost more than it paid. Then my ex said some magic words. "Stop being so picky. You're never going to earn more than minimum wage." I saw red. Then I found the ad. They advertised free training to become a software engineer, professional certification, and get you a job afterwards. The only requirement was a high school diploma with a passing math grade. At first, I was very wary because it definitely felt like it was too good to be true and possibly a scam. But I had nothing to lose by just checking it out, so off I went. The first day of the acceptance process was grueling. Multiple timed aptitude tests that took hours. The ones who passed were invited for a second round of tests. This time there were a lot less people. Out of the 30 people from the first day, only 2 of us were accepted at the end. And it wasn't a scam. The reason why it was free was because the employers would pay for the training. I was thrilled. Then followed the most intense 4 months of my life. I was determined to prove my ex wrong. 8 hours in class every weekday, another 6 for homework and studying, then studying and doing a weekend project for another 20 hours over the weekend. I only got about 6 hours of sleep each night. Thankfully, my son was sleeping through the night by then, and I made it. Did really well in my final exams too. The job search was short and sweet. And since it was only 3 years before Y2K, and even entry-level engineers were earning good salaries, when I got my offer, my salary was more than my ex got. Internally, I was elated and thought, "Take that, you insufferable jerk." Didn't say it out loud though. As time went by, I kept getting really good raises and promotions. My ex finally had enough of the humiliation and wanted a divorce. I jumped at the chance to escape, and that is how my ex became my ex. ETA, while I was studying, my mother took care of my son and my in-laws helped with groceries and utilities. My ex could only afford to pay for rent and gas. Hearing a story like this is very inspirational, and honestly, as sad as it may sound, hearing a story like this helps me at least churn through the day's work a little harder. I wish I could take like 50 stories like this, melt them all down, and inject them straight into my brain or something. P. Mouse Brown commented, I remember the whining after Y2K that it wasn't that bad and what was all the fuss about. It wasn't all that bad because everyone in IT worked their collective butts off to make sure it wasn't. I'm also old enough to remember why they never had the 19 coded in the programs. 5081 cards with limited space and the cost of storage meant every byte had to be worth it. Our next story is, may the truck driver back way up. As I was leaving a store, I was backing out of a space on a narrow single-lane parking aisle, one way headed away from the store, and just as I backed out, a large truck with a trailer proceeded to pull out of a double spot much further down, where there were lots of empty spaces for him to maneuver, but instead of exiting the correct way, he decided to turn and go against traffic. I saw this happening and could have pulled back into my spot and wait for him to exit, but nope. I had to teach him a lesson for going the wrong way, especially in a narrow single-lane aisle. So I proudly drove toward him as he drove toward me. I thought he'd get the hint and stop, but he didn't until we got pretty close. He honked, I honked, I stared him down. He finally conceded and backed up that trailer about 20 parking spots. It's so annoying when you see somebody just running on autopilot doing stuff like this. I remember just the other day being in a parking lot and somebody goes up the blatantly wrong direction. There's another car trying to pull in and the lady that's going the wrong way just yells, "Well, I'm already here, so back up and let me out." 1,000,000% that's the situation where you fold your arms and just wave them off, and you take that gamble of whether or not they'll just slam into your front bumper or they'll finally just back up all the way down and out. Mother Goose 1957 commented, reminds me of the time my father did this to a woman who was entering the shopping center car park via the exit lane. She honked and flapped her hand to indicate my father should back up. He shook his head and pointed to the one-way sign. She continued to flick her hand at him. Dad picked up his newspaper and held it up to indicate he was prepared to sit there and read the paper for as long as it took. She eventually had to back out and go around the block to access the entrance, which required her to reverse out into heavy traffic. Man, was she ticked. This next story is the day I was invisible. Years ago, I worked at a public school. The district assigned us a temporary administrator, a man who knew what was wrong with everyone and everything and just how to fix it all. He drove us up the wall. I spent his entire time with us making bets on who would be the first to cram him into a locker. One thing he hated was how other people would go to deal with things, leaving the command center, the office, instead of commanding. One day, he walked into the office and the receptionist was in the restroom. The principal was in a meeting and the office manager had gone to look at something. I, the registrar, was working head down at my desk. The man walked into the middle of the room and announced on the radio to 15 people, criticizing all of them, including the principal in her meeting, "The office is completely empty. What if a parent walked in?" He was 5 feet from me. I picked up my radio and said to him and 15 other people, "Dr. So-and-so, I'm right here. Hi, your glasses are on your head, sir." Small, but very satisfying. Surely the principal would have some kind of dressing down with him, even if they're not in a position to really reprimand them for anything like that. This almost feels like a child acting out because they just don't understand how daycare works. They just need a little pat on the head and being told, "Don't worry, there's systems in place to handle things." Believe it or not, we did happen to think about what if a parent would happen to walk in. Give them that syrupy sweet crap that no one likes. Our next story is, sometimes it may backfire. My ex-husband was a very recent amputee, out of the hospital 2 days recent. He's also a chef, so when I told him I was going to a certain grocery store, he insisted he had to go with me. We parked in the handicap spot with a wheelchair area so I could help him in and out. When we came out, some jerk had parked in the wheelchair access area, so close that I couldn't even open his door. No placard or plate to indicate that they needed a handicap parking spot, and one just wasn't available. I lost my crap. I was tired, stressed, and angry, so I took my keys and basically destroyed the side of the car that was closest to mine. I got in the driver's seat so I could back out and load my ex in the traffic lane, and my car wouldn't start. It took about 30 to 45 minutes to get it started, loose battery connector, before I could get out of there. By this time, I've sort of calmed down about the parking. I'd wheeled my ex inside to stay warm, but I was so afraid that they would come out there and there would be a physical altercation. Luckily, I never saw them, but I've never seriously considered doing that again. Hopefully, they never considered parking like that again. Either way, I have no regrets. They deserved it. While I would never necessarily advocate for somebody tearing up somebody's car like that, all I can say is, I didn't see no scratched car. Farvog1964 commented, "There's a tiny tool the size of your thumbnail called a valve stem core extractor. It lets you remove the center bit of a tire's valve stem, the core, letting all the air out. There's no damage to the tire. Take the cores and tape them to the windshield so you didn't even steal anything. They can put the valves back in, if they have the tool. Some air and they're good to go, but not easily or quickly." Our next story is the laptop charger. So this girl at work was always borrowing my laptop charger without asking, super rude. One day I decided to play her game but with a twist. Every time she took it, I hid it in ridiculous spots like under the freezer, behind the bookshelf, even inside the pantry. LOL, sorry, charger. She'd panic asking where it went, and I'd just be like, I don't know. Eventually, she bought her own charger, and I couldn't stop laughing. Moral of the story, don't mess with my stuff unless you want a scavenger hunt. All I can say is in regards to chargers is, unless there's somebody that's very close to you, like a very dear friend or family, don't lend them your charger because chances are, if they can get away with keeping it or saying they lost it or something, they probably will. I'm not going to get over the time I lent a classmate a Game Boy Advance charger and never got it back. Our next story is how to silence a monster. I'll just say it bluntly at the start here, my genetic father is a horrible human being. By this point, I've completely cut contact with him. However, this happened on the very last time I ever had to see him. My mother left him when I was about 13-ish. However, due to his lies and manipulation, the court system failed me and I was still forced to see him. So the abuse he inflicted continued until I was 18 and only got worse after the divorce because he knew that hurting me meant it would hurt my mother. He is the absolute definition of trash. And my rather unique situation was only fuel on this dumpster fire. I won't go into too great of detail about his depravity, but I will simplify it and say that if you weren't a straight white man or a straight woman in a prairie dress, then you were going to heck in his eyes and didn't deserve the time of day. As for me, being born as both genders, it was a living heck. I am intersex, which basically means I have incomplete traits from both sides. I actually didn't even find this out until I was almost an adult. However, I had a lot of health problems because of it. And due to looking highly androgynous growing up, I was called a freak. At birth, I was signed off as a girl, and when I began having some unique changes with puberty, it was drilled into me that I was basically just an ugly woman who didn't deserve anything because I didn't meet my father's standards. The discussion about my gender and who I am is a very long story. However, as an adult, I made the choice for both my physical and mental health to become fully male. Due to my father, there were only two people in my entire family who knew about this: my mother and my grandmother on my father's side. My mother is an amazing person and was extremely happy for me, and my grandmother was the sweetest woman you'd ever meet. Picture the stereotypical grandma who bakes cookies and children's books, and that was her. The woman would give her last penny just to make sure you felt happy and safe. She was delighted to hear that I was starting to find who I was. My grandfather passed away shortly after I was born. However, my grandmother started dating again many years later, and when I was 18, I got an invitation to her wedding. She was in her 70s and acting like a teenager with her new fiance, and it was amazing to see her so happy. Of course I wanted to go. There was just one problem: my father would be there too. At this point, I was already on hormone therapy for my treatments, had facial hair, a flat chest, didn't even look like my old self anymore, and I didn't want to think of the heck that would rain down from my father seeing me like this. But then I stopped myself in that moment and thought about it a little more, and after a bit of contemplating, I figured this would be perfect. He'd always lied to family about what happened, painting himself as this loving father. So what kind of perfect dad wouldn't be happy for their son? Out of absolute spite, I went to a thrift store, got myself a classy black and purple gown, got some makeup, a pair of heels, and went to the wedding in full drag. My mother questioned as to why I was dressing up like a woman for this instead of just grabbing my suit, and when I told her what I was going to do, she broke out into full belly laughter and began insisting on helping me get ready to go. The wedding was lovely, everyone was smiling, my grandmother was glowing the entire time, and I actually didn't see my father for the bulk of the reception. We had a big family, so I wasn't really surprised. However, at the end, as everyone was talking and getting cake, that's when my father spotted me. By this point, most of my family didn't even recognize me. However, when I was standing next to my mother, my father must have put the pieces together and started walking over. I told my mother to go and be with my grandmother, and I was now left alone with my abuser in a crowd of people. He came right up to me, asked how I was doing, and I just shrugged and continued people watching. He leaned up against the wall with me, and just as I expected, he began lecturing me. He pointed to my grandmother and now step-grandfather and said, "You see that? Make sure you get yourself a good man like that. Someone who makes enough to support you so you can stay home." I looked over at him, and in my now deep voice, I said very simply, "That would be great if I didn't have a girlfriend." I wish I had a camera right at that moment just to capture the image of his eyes growing wide as he choked on his own words. And for the first time, he was left speechless. I could see him getting angry and trying hard to contain it, but I didn't care. I just casually waved over my grandmother. She came over smiling, and for the very first time, I spoke openly with her in front of my father, telling her about my girlfriend and my journey into becoming a man. She was thrilled for me having a girlfriend, giving me a huge hug and telling me to invite her so that she could come celebrate with everyone. And so, that's exactly what I did. My father remained speechless, just staring at me as his face turned red, not daring to say a dang thing in front of his own mother and the entire family. This was the one time that he was forced to be a decent human being to his child because he was surrounded by everyone he had lied to, and he was stuck between that lie and the man he really was. After a while of him just stewing in his very clear anger, he turned around and left without a word, walking out on his own mother's wedding. My grandmother had me and my mother sit with her and her now husband at a table, and we all laughed and ate, enjoying our time together and making memories without him. My step-grandfather asked why my father left so suddenly and asked if everything was all right, and when I told him what happened, he looked at me with a sigh and said, "This is supposed to be a joining of families today. If he doesn't want to be a part of that family, then so be it." You know, to put it simply, I think it's for the best that he walked out. At least he didn't make like a big scene about things. At least they did keep it relatively civil, just because, you know, they can never be wrong. I mean, people still kind of end up knowing who he is because of his actions, even without him choosing to out himself as a hypocrite. Straw Trash commented, "I'm so sorry your father is a butt. My son is transgender, and his grandmother and I have totally been on his side since day one. However, his father went ballistic. We are divorced, and they no longer have a relationship. I'm so glad you have your mom and grandparents too. You deserve all the love and support." Our next story is, "Don't pay me and treat me like dirt. I will hide and lock your company's files and ghost you." So for context, I started my teaching career as an ESL teacher in Asia. I worked from some pretty cool places, but the last place I worked at before I became a teacher was the worst. Let's call it English Center. For privacy reasons, I won't tell you the city or country as I'm still working there. English Center had around 3 centers owned by the same owner. Now, this center was run by an owner who basically used the business as a cash cow. He would overwork you and underpay you. I often had to threaten to take him to court to pay me on time. So I was contracted to work 4 classes a day of 1 hour each initially. Eventually, I was given 6 classes and very little marking and contract time. On top of that, you were expected to work after hours and do marking during your lunch. I was also forced to be a center manager and admin, so not only was I teaching, I had to deal with admin and teacher and center issues as well. After being paid late for the 4th time, I decided I'd had enough, so I started looking for a new job. I got a job at a new school and started my visa renewal process. This takes 4 weeks. I also didn't tell the owner I was leaving either. At this point, I also had admin access to the center server/network. This had the entire syllabus and everything. It also had student progress and reports, which were given to parents monthly. If this file disappeared, the school would be screwed. 4 weeks later, on my last day, the owner yelled at me for something silly, can't remember what, and dumped an extra class on me and then told me to work on my day off. At this point, I was seeing red and was about to delete everything. Instead, I selected the files and put a password, a random combo of letters and symbols on them, and then selected them to be hidden so they couldn't be seen. So if you click the file properties, one can see. I then simply packed my stuff and walked out into the morning sun. A while later, the owner tried to keep on calling me. At this point, I was on the beach sipping an ice-cold beer. I ignored him and continued ignoring him. After a year, I met someone who said that the owner couldn't find the files and was panicking because parents were demanding to see their children's progress. In addition, many teachers walked out, which resulted in him having to close his business. Can we all agree that this guy and his business was doomed from the get-go? If you have a business that solely operates on something as structurally sound as the Death Star, where you have one small hole, aka file, that if disappeared or blown up would cause the complete destruction of your entire business, you should not be operating that business in any way. If I were that owner, I would be paranoid to have like 5 different backup systems constantly in place. McQuay92 commented, "Ghosting him turned his company into a ghost." Our next story is, block my route? I'll take my grocery bags out and leave the cart in front of your door. At Whole Foods, some thoughtless dimwit was parking in the red and no parking zone right in front of the doors. They were just sitting in the driver's seat, waiting. On my way out, there was no good way to go past them other than to block all traffic by rolling directly down the main corridor of the parking lot. So I kept going, stopped when their car wouldn't let me pass, and then grabbed my groceries and left the cart directly in front of their door. Then they followed me to my car and tried to park in a way to block me from exiting, but the joke's on them because they left me just enough room to reverse out, inches from their bumper, and I casually drove away. They were super surprised, and I'm sure they thought I was going to hit them. Luckily, I know exactly how big my car is, and I'm not afraid to use that knowledge. Somebody who knows exactly how big their machine is and not being afraid to use it, someone after my own heart. Administration Key commented, "Everyone knows the white zone is for immediate loading and unloading of passengers only. There is no parking in the red zone." Our next story is, cheat on me? Fine, you'll never win the lottery jackpot. So my ex had a vivid dream one time. She saw herself winning the lottery and woke up and instantly wrote down the numbers. She uses them for every single draw and always said she will for the rest of her life or until she wins, which she is convinced will happen. Well, she cheated on me recently and so I broke up with her, but I know those lottery numbers after having bought her tickets on multiple occasions. So for the last 3 weeks, I've bought tickets to every draw using the same numbers, and I will for the rest of my life or until I win. Even if she wins, she'll have to share the jackpot with me. Not gonna lie, the idea of getting like a lottery ticket a week always seemed kind of fun to me. Even though, let's be real, you know you're just kind of throwing away the money. Although, to be fair, I think I would rather do random numbers every time than use these fixed numbers that your cheating ex had in a vivid dream. You really think luck or karma is going to be on the side of somebody like that? Well, to be fair, I don't know. It seems like a lot of less than savory people get a lot of luck sometimes. Kamima Nekineko commented, "Haha, just don't break the bank to get that revenge. I'd do the same. Screw my own lucky numbers, I'll take hers too. Post them so she has to share with more than one." Our next story is, scammer wasted 5 minutes of my time, pranked him for an entire year. Someone tried to pull an eBay refund scam on me. eBay and PayPal immediately spotted it and reversed the charge. But then he called me directly and told me they were wrong and I still needed to give him money, even providing a fake tracking number. I saw this as a great opportunity to mess with him. So I told him I would send him a very valuable package, but he just needed to call back in a few days. A few days later, he called back and I, unfortunately, passed away. So he spoke with my manager, me, and over the course of a year, he ended up speaking with 12 different people, all me, at a fake company. Every time he called, I made things more absurd, assuming he would hang up on me. He ended up sticking with it for an entire year. I was even doing celebrity impressions, and I stopped giving them fake names. Some of them were just the names of the celebrities like Michael Caine and Jeff Goldblum. I mean, you gotta give it to the scammer. They want one thing and one thing only: your hard-earned money and or possessions. They probably aren't that bright. They probably don't even know who Michael Caine or Jeff Goldblum is. Which honestly, I feel bad for them because Jeff Goldblum is kind of a treasure. Catalyst Boy Mom commented, "My kid got another call yesterday. I don't get them anymore. Wanting to buy his property. He had her convinced he was going to sell her 10 acres of oceanfront property in Arizona for nearly 15 minutes. The dock and boathouse, 5 miles of riding trails through the pine trees, 2 saltwater pools, a guest house, 5,000 square foot underground bunker and firing range didn't even tip her off." He finally got bored and told her Arizona is landlocked before she finally hung up. The stupidity is amazing. But with that being said, that's all the time we have for today. Now, if you want to hear another absolutely awesome revenge story, check out that video on the left. Or if you missed my latest video, check out that video on the right. That said, I'll see you all next time with some more stories.